Simulacra and Simulation by Jean Baudrillard. Read by Stеaдyy Делта. Part 3. Ramses or the Rosy-Colored Resurrection. Ethnology brushed up against its paradoxical death in 1971, the day when the Philippine government decided to return the few dozen Tsеaдyy who had just been discovered in the depths of the jungle, where they had lived for 8 centuries without any contact with the rest of the species, to their primitive state, out of reach of colonizers, tourists, and ethnologists. This at the suggestion of anthropologists themselves, who were seeing the indigenous people disintegrate immediately upon contact, like mummies in the open air. In order for ethnology to live, its object must die. By dying, the object takes its revenge for being discovered, and with its death defies the science that wants to grasp it. Doesn't all science live on this paradoxical slope to which it is doomed by the evanescence of its object in its very apprehension, and by the pitiless reversal that the dead object exerts on it? Like Orpheus, it always turns around too soon, and like Eurydice, its object falls back into Hades. It is against this hell of the paradox that the ethnologists wished to protect themselves by cordoning off the Tsеaдyy with virgin forest. No one can touch them anymore. As in a mine, the vein is closed down. Science loses precious capital there, but the object will be safe, lost to science, but intact in its virginity. It is not a question of sacrifice. Science never sacrifices itself. It is always murderous. But of the simulated sacrifice of its object in order to save its reality principle. The Tsеaдyy, frozen in their natural element, will provide a perfect alibi, an eternal guarantee. Here begins an anti-ethnology that will never end, and to which Jaulin, Castañeda, and Clastres are various witnesses. In any case, the logical evolution of a science is to distance itself increasingly from its object, until it dispenses with it entirely. Its autonomy is only rendered even more fantastic. It attains its pure form. The Indian thus returned to the ghetto, in the glass coffin of the virgin forest, again becomes the model of simulation of all the possible Indians from before ethnology. This model thus grants itself the luxury to incarnate itself beyond itself in the brute reality of these Indians. It has entirely reinvented. Savages who are indebted to ethnology for still being savages. What a turn of events, what a triumph for this science that seemed dedicated to their destruction. Of course, these savages are posthumous. Frozen, cryogenized, sterilized, protected to death, they have become referential simulacra, and science itself has become pure simulation. The same holds true at Creusot, at the level of the open museum, where one museum-fied in situ as historical witnesses of the period. Entire working-class neighborhoods, living metallurgic zones, and entire culture, men, women, and children included, gestures, languages, customs fossilized alive as in a snapshot. The museum, instead of being circumscribed as a geometric site, is everywhere now, like a dimension of life. Thus, ethnology, rather than circumscribing life as an objective science, will today, liberated from its object, be applied to all living things and make itself invisible, like an omnipresent fourth dimension, that of the simulacrum. We are all Tsеadyys, Indians who have again become what they were, simulacral Indians who at last proclaim the universal truth of ethnology. We have all become living specimens in the spectral light of ethnology, or of anti-ethnology, which is nothing but the pure form of triumphal ethnology under the sign of dead differences and of the resurrection of the differences. It is thus very naive to look for ethnology in the savages or in some third world. It is here, everywhere, in the metropolises, in the white community, in a world completely catalogued and analyzed, then artificially resurrected under the auspices of the real, in a world of simulation, of the hallucination of truth, of the blackmail of the real, of the murder of every symbolic form, and of its historical retrospection, a murder of which the savages, noblesse oblige, were the first victims, but that for a long time has extended to all Western societies. But in the same breath, ethnology grants us its only and final lesson, the secret that kills it, and which the savages knew better than it did, the vengeance of the dead. The confinement of the scientific object is equal to the confinement of the mad and of the dead. And just as all society is irremediably contaminated by this mirror of madness that it is held up to itself, science can't help but die, contaminated by the death of this object that is its inverse mirror. It is science that masters the objects, but it is the objects that invest it with depth, according to an unconscious reversion which only gives a dead and circular response to a dead and circular interrogation. Nothing changes when society breaks the mirror of madness, abolishes the asylums, gives speech back to the insane, etc., nor when science seems to break the mirror of its own objectivity, effacing itself before its object, as in Castaneda, etc., and to bend down before the differences. The form produced by confinement is followed by an innumerable, diffracted, slowed-down mechanism. As ethnology collapses in its classical institution, it survives in an anti-ethnology whose task it is to re-inject the difference fiction, the savage fiction everywhere, to conceal that it is this world, ours, which has again become savage in its way, that is to say, which is devastated by difference and by death. In the same way, with the pretext of saving the original, one forbade visitors to enter the Lascaux caves, but an exact replica was constructed 500 meters from it, so that everyone could see them. One glances through a peephole at the authentic cave, and then one visits the reconstituted hole. It is possible that the memory of the original grottos itself, stamped in the minds of future generations, but from now on there is no longer any difference. The duplication suffices to render both artificial. In the same way, science and technology were recently mobilized to save the mummy of Ramses II after it was left to rot for several dozen years in the depths of a museum. The West is seized with panic at the thought of not being able to save what the symbolic order had been able to conserve for 40 centuries. But out of sight and far from the light of day, Ramses does not signify anything for us. Only the mummy is of an inestimable worth because it is what guarantees that accumulation has meaning. Our entire linear and accumulative culture collapses if we cannot stockpile the past in plain view. To this end, the pharaohs must be brought out of their tomb and the mummies out of their silence. To this end, they must be exhumed and given military honors. They are a prey to both science and worms. Only absolute secrecy assured them this millennial power, the mastery over putrefaction that signified the mastery of the complete cycle of exchanges with death. We only know how to place our science in service of repairing the mummy, that is to say, restoring a visible order, whereas embalming was a mythical effort that strove to immortalize a hidden dimension. We require a visible past, a visible continuum, a visible myth of origin, which reassures us about our end, because finally we have never believed in them. Whence this historic scene of the reception of the mummy at the Orly airport. Why? Because Ramses was a great despotic and military figure? Certainly, but mostly because our culture dreams, behind this defunct power that it tries to annex, of an order that would have nothing to do with it, and it dreams of it because it exterminated it by exhuming it as its own past. We are fascinated by Ramses as Renaissance Christians were by the American Indians, those human beings who had never known the word of Christ. Thus, at the beginning of colonization, there was a moment of stupor and bewilderment before the very possibility of escaping the universal law of the gospel. There were two possible responses: either admit that this law was not universal, or exterminate the Indians to efface the evidence. In general, one contented oneself with converting them, or even simply discovering them, which would suffice to slowly exterminate them. Thus, it would have been enough to exhume Ramses to ensure his extermination by museumification. Because mummies don't rot from worms, they die from being transplanted from a slow order of the symbolic, master over putrefaction and death, to an order of history, science, and museums, our order, which no longer masters anything, which only knows how to condemn what preceded it to decay and death, and subsequently to try and revive it with science. Irreparable violence toward all secrets, the violence of a civilization without secrets, hatred of a whole civilization for its own foundation. And just as with ethnology, which plays at extricating itself from its object to better secure itself in its pure form, de-museumification is nothing but another spiral in artificiality. Witness the cloister of Saint Michel de Cucha, which one will repatriate at great cost from the cloisters in New York to reinstall it in its original site, and everyone is supposed to applaud this restitution, as they did the experimental campaign to take back the sidewalks on the Champs-Élysées. Well, if the exportation of cornices was in effect an arbitrary act, the cloisters in New York are an artificial mosaic of all cultures, following a logic of the capitalist centralization of value. Their reimportation to the original site is even more artificial. It is a total simulacrum that links up with reality through a complete circumvolution. The cloister should have stayed in New York in its simulated environment, which at least fooled no one. Repatriating it is nothing but a supplementary subterfuge, acting as if nothing had happened and indulging in retrospective hallucination. In the same way, Americans flatter themselves for having brought the population of the Indians back to pre-conquest levels. One effaces everything and starts over. They even flatter themselves for doing better, for exceeding the original number. This is presented as proof of the superiority of civilization. It will produce more Indians than they themselves were able to do. With sinister derision, this overproduction is again a means of destroying them. For Indian culture, like all tribal culture, rests on the limitation of the group and the refusal of any unlimited increase, as can be seen in Ishi's case. In this way, their demographic promotion is just another step towards symbolic extermination. Everywhere we live in a universe strangely similar to the original, things are doubled by their own scenario. But this doubling does not signify, as it did traditionally, the imminence of their death. They are already purged of their death, and better than when they were alive, more cheerful, more authentic, in the light of their model, like the faces in funeral homes.